Hello friends, my name is Dr. David Litwa, and on this channel I teach about the darker side of early Christianity, the side that other Christians rejected as wrong and evil, dangerous, and even blasphemous. I've written a book on this other side of Christianity called Found Christianities. A chapter in that book dealt with Marcion of Pontus, arguably the creator of the New Testament, as a collection combining a life of Jesus with a series of Pauline letters. Marcion is known for many things, but in this short lesson, I want to focus on Marcion and Christmas, by which I mean Marcion and the birth of Jesus. Another way of asking this question is, if Marcionite Christianity had won in the 2nd century to become the dominant form of Christianity, would Christians and the world still be celebrating Christmas today? If Christmas is about the birth of a divine baby, did Marcion deny that Jesus was born in order to preserve his divinity? One of Marcion's greatest opponents, if not the greatest, was Tertullian of Carthage, who wrote some 60 years after Marcion thrived in Rome. Tertullian is famous for writing a 5-book refutation of Marcion, making up 20% of Tertullian's whole surviving output. This series of volumes systematically tries to deconstruct everything that Marcion believed. And in book 3 of this work, we have Tertullian claiming, as he often did, that for Marcion, Jesus did not come in a real human body. To quote just a section here, quote, "All these magic tricks about an imaginary body for Christ, Marcion assumed so that the witness of human nature could not be used to defend Christ's birth," unquote. Now, the question that we have today is, was Tertullian right? Did Marcion actually think that Jesus was not born and that he did not have a body like the body that you and I have? What were the data points that Tertullian used to conclude this teaching about Christ? And was Tertullian pulling directly from Marcionite doctrine, or was he making a series of inferences that may well be wrong? There is a saying of Jesus that those who dig a hole fall into it, and Tertullian is a great example of someone whose arguments could be used against him. Because Tertullian himself realized that although he dogmatically believed that for Marcion, Jesus wasn't a real human being, that Marcion's text, that is, the Evangelion, or simply the Gospel, did seem to assume that Jesus was a real human being. And Tertullian realizes this at one point in the course of his argument and says, quote, "Without a doubt, the one viewed as human is assumed to have been born. For a certain woman exclaimed in the Gospel, 'Blessed the womb which bore you and the breasts which gave you suck.' And how," speaking of another passage, "are his mother and brothers said to be standing outside," unquote. Tertullian is wise enough to know that there are sections of Marcion's Gospel which assume that Jesus was human with a family, a real mother, and real brothers who are never said to be his brothers-in-law or to be adopted or what have you. They are his real brothers, and he had a real mother. And this is important because if we are going to reconstruct the doctrine of Marcion, we have to begin not with the statements of heresiologists, but with the contents of his own gospel. Now, make no mistake, Marcion's gospel is a reconstruction. It does not survive in any manuscript, but it is quoted often. And one of the more secure data points about Marcion's gospel is how it began. And it began with the words, "In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate governed in Judea." That is, it started its story with Jesus as an adult. And that's important. It did not include what we think of as the birth narratives, those sections in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that are combined to create the Christmas story. So that's key. Whether or not one believes that Marcion's Gospel is late or early, whether edited or original, this is how it began. And it began, in other words, much like the Gospel of Mark, without a nativity story. That is to say, Marcion's Gospel did not have those very famous passages about the birth of John the Baptist, the annunciation of Gabriel to Mary in Nazareth, the visit of Mary to Elizabeth in Judea, the story of the shepherds and the angels, and the story of Jesus presented in the temple and being held by Simeon. All of these things were not in Marcion's gospel. So the question is, if he did not have this nativity story, which is a birth story, did he believe in the birth of Jesus? It seems that Tertullian made the assumption that because the birth story was not present, that Marcion must not have thought that Jesus was born. And Tertullian also assumed that Marcion was the one who removed the birth story. And if he removed the birth story, then he must not have thought that Jesus was born. But as has lately been argued, and I think demonstrated, Marcion was not an editor, and he did not remove the birth story. He inherited a gospel in which the birth story, much as we see in the Gospel of Mark, was simply not there. So we return to our question, is it then true that, according to Marcion, Jesus was never born? Well, one can have a biography of a figure such as Abraham Lincoln or George Washington, and one can begin that biography when Lincoln or Washington was an adult. If a biographer does not include the birth of Lincoln or Washington, that biographer is not thereby denying that Lincoln or Washington was born, and everybody knows that, and everybody assumes that, and I think it's safe to say that Marcion himself assumed that, and there are reasons why we can say that that's a safe inference. We can cite, for instance, the very passage that Tertullian cited, chapter 8, verse 20 of Marcion's Gospel, which has been reconstructed and verified as attested in that Gospel. Quote, "It was announced to him, namely Jesus, your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to see you," unquote. Now, in the next verse, Jesus says that his mother and his brothers are those who are his true disciples who hear his word, and that's all true. But in making that statement about his metaphorical family, he never denied that he had an actual family. And so I think Marcion could well assume that Jesus had a physical mother and physical brothers who shared his genetic code, and if that's the case, then surely he was born. If he was not born, he would not have a mother. So my thesis is that Marcion probably did not assume that Jesus was never born, and we can tell this from the only text that survives, which is a sure guide to Marcionite thought, and that is the gospel used by Marcionites. That gospel is a reconstruction, but its attestation is relatively secure. And that's the basis upon which we build an argument. So that means that Tertullian cannot be taken at his word. If we imagine a world in which only the Gospel of Mark was written and we never had the Gospels of Matthew and Luke or any other Gospel that told a birth story, surely Christmas would look different, but Christians would not deny that Jesus had been born. It would be something that they simply assumed, just as they assumed that Elijah and Moses were born, and every other hero, even though, in the case of Elijah at least, the birth story was not told, and that's perfectly acceptable in the genre of gospel literature. You don't need a birth story. We don't need it in the Gospel of Thomas. We don't need it in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, in most of the gospel literature that has survived from Nag Hammadi and elsewhere, we don't have a story of Jesus's birth, and that was perfectly acceptable. Now, it may be the case, and I emphasize may, that Marcion believed that the nature of Jesus' flesh was somehow special. But in fact, there's little evidence of this beyond polemical accusations of Tertullian and others. We do know that Marcion's disciple, Apelles, believed that Christ was not born, but that he descended, as in the ascension of Isaiah, from heaven, and that he gathered the elements and made his own body as a divine being, a body which was true flesh, but it simply was not born. It is unsafe to impute this idea or to retroject it back to Marcion, but it is important to see that later Marcionites did, in fact, deny Jesus's birth. But interestingly, even these later Marcionites who believed that Jesus's body was a special creation, they never denied that Jesus didn't have a real body. It was as real as my body and your body is. It just was specially created in a divine laboratory, so to speak, and not born. Now, this is just a short video. Typically, I only release these shorter style of videos, but there is much more content available on my Patreon, on Marcion, on Gnosis, on Hermeticism, on Nag Hammadi, on many, many other topics. So catch me on Patreon. There you can also join the tier to ask me questions, and I can do my best to answer them. I want to thank everybody for coming along and having a listen. If this has been interesting, leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe. And from Marcion, Merry Christmas.